The candle has burned down to almost nothing, and still he cannot sleep. Outside the window, Washington is quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after midnight, when even the guards posted along the fence have stopped pacing. Inside, a tall, weary man sits alone with a stack of letters he has read a dozen times already, mothers mostly, asking him to spare a son, a brother, a husband. Some of the letters he can answer with a word in the margin, a pardon, a transfer, a second chance. Most of them he cannot answer at all. He rubs his eyes. He is not an old man, not by the numbers, but the last few years have aged him the way war ages anyone who has to carry it. He thinks, as he often does at this hour, of a one-room cabin with a dirt floor and a boy who once thought that owning 3 books made him rich. That boy grew up to be Abraham Lincoln. It is easy, looking back from a comfortable distance, to forget that greatness, like his, rarely announces itself early. It arrives slowly, through hardship, through loss, through the kind of quiet persistence that doesn't look like destiny at all while it's happening. Perhaps you've known someone like that in your own life. Someone who became remarkable only because they refused to stop, long after it would have been easier to. Good evening, and thank you for spending some of it with us. If stories like this, the long, unglamorous road behind the men and women history remembers, are the kind you enjoy, you're welcome to stay a while and follow along for more. Tonight, we're going back to where it all began, a log cabin in Kentucky, and the boy who would one day hold a fractured country together. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809 in a single-room log cabin near Hodgenville, Kentucky, to parents who owned almost nothing and expected to own little more. His father, Thomas, was a farmer who moved his family from one hard patch of land to another, always searching for soil that might finally cooperate. His mother, Nancy, could read but not write, and she raised her children on scripture recited from memory because there was no money for school books and precious little time for school at all. When Lincoln was 7, the family moved to Indiana, into wilderness so thick his father had to clear it by hand before they could plant anything at all. 2 years later, Nancy Lincoln died of what settlers at the time simply called milk sickness. Abraham was 9 years old. He would later say almost nothing about that loss in public life, a private grief carried quietly, the way so many griefs were carried in that era, without much room to speak of them at all. He did not yet know how much that early hardship would shape him, but it already had. What Lincoln lacked in formal schooling, by his own count, less than a year total, spread across his boyhood, he made up for in a hunger for reading that neighbors remembered decades later. He walked miles to borrow books he could not afford to own. In one often told account, a book he had borrowed was ruined by rain leaking through the cabin roof, and rather than simply apologize, young Lincoln worked days in the neighbor's field until the debt was paid in full. It was a small thing. It was also, in its way, the whole of his character in miniature. If something was owed, it got paid. Even if it cost him sweat, he could barely spare. By his early 20s, he had left his father's house. The two were never especially close, and drifted through a string of jobs, splitting rails, working a flatboat down the Mississippi, running a failed store, serving as a village postmaster who reportedly carried undelivered letters in his hat. None of it looked like the beginning of anything historic. It looked instead like an ordinary young man trying to find solid footing in an unforgiving country. But he did not yet know what waited for him in the law and in politics, and neither did anyone else. Lincoln taught himself law, borrowing texts, and studying by firelight, the way he had studied everything else in his life. He was admitted to the bar in 1836 and settled into a modest but respected career in Springfield, Illinois, a career built less on brilliance than on an almost stubborn thoroughness, and on a plain-spoken honesty that jurors and colleagues came to trust. Politics came next, first in the Illinois state legislature, later a single term in Congress, where he was, by most accounts, an unremarkable freshman lawmaker who left few marks on the record. For years afterward, he seemed to step back from public life almost entirely, tending to his law practice, raising a family, watching from a distance as the argument over slavery grew louder and less avoidable with each passing year. It was the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, a law that opened the possibility of slavery spreading into new territories, that pulled him back in. In 1858, running for the Senate against a formidable opponent, Stephen Douglas, Lincoln argued across a series of public debates that a nation could not endure permanently divided over something as fundamental as human bondage. He lost that Senate race, but the words he'd spoken in those debates traveled further than the office he'd failed to win. And 2 years later, they helped carry him to the presidency. He had not yet faced the hardest test of his life. It was still ahead. Lincoln won the presidency in November of 1860, and before he had even taken the oath of office, 7 Southern states had voted to leave the Union rather than accept him. By the time he was inaugurated in March of 1861, the country he'd been elected to lead was already coming apart in his hands. A little over a month later, the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter. What followed were 4 years that would have broken most men entirely. Lincoln oversaw a war effort riddled with early defeats, feuding generals, and mounting casualties that reached into nearly every American household, North and South alike. He buried his own son, Willie, in the middle of it in 1862. Grief layered on top of grief, carried in a house that was, quite literally, the seat of a nation at war with itself. And still, in the middle of all of it, he made a decision that would outlast every battle. In January of 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in the rebelling states were to be free. It did not end slavery outright, but it changed permanently what the war was being fought for. He had not yet seen how it would end. No one had. By the time Lincoln stood at Gettysburg in November of 1863 to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen, he spoke for barely 2 minutes, a short address by the standards of the day, and one that newspapers at the time didn't even consider especially remarkable. He said the nation would have a new birth of freedom and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, should not perish from the earth. It is remembered now as one of the most important speeches in American history. It did not feel that way to the man who delivered it, walking off the platform, uncertain he'd said anything worth remembering at all. The war ground on for another year and a half after that. It ended finally in the spring of 1865, with the Union preserved and slavery on its way to formal abolition through the 13th Amendment. Lincoln had aged a decade in 4 years. Photographs from his final months show a face carved by exhaustion and grief that no election victory could erase. He had 5 days to see the peace he had fought for. Then, on April 14th, 1865, he was shot while attending a play at Ford's Theater and died the following morning. What Lincoln left behind was not a finished country. No one leaves that behind, no matter how long they live. What he left was a union that still existed, a promise of freedom written into law, and a plain, hard-won example of what it looks like to hold something together through the worst it can offer, one difficult decision at a time. He was never the polished figure that later portraits made him out to be. He struggled with deep bouts of melancholy his whole life. He made mistakes, misjudged some of his generals, and second-guessed himself more than the marble statues suggest. He was, in the end, simply a man who refused to let hardship be the last word. First as a boy with borrowed books, later as a president with a divided country. That candle in the White House burning down past midnight. It's easy to picture now, knowing how the story ends. But he didn't have that comfort. He carried the weight of it the same way he'd carried everything else in his life, without any guarantee it would turn out right, and without anyone telling him it eventually would. Maybe that's the part of his story worth sitting with longest. Not the speeches, not the monuments, but the plain, patient refusal to quit that got a poor boy from a Kentucky cabin all the way to the room where a nation was, quite literally, put back together. Most of us will never carry a burden as heavy as his, but most of us know, in our own way, what it costs to keep going when the outcome isn't certain at all, and what it means to look back years later and realize it was worth it. If this story stayed with you tonight, we'd love to hear what part of it did. And if there's another life you'd like us to tell next, let us know in the comments below. Thank you for spending this time with us.